So, this online lecture is going to cover what we didn't get to in class the other day. And so, these are just a few slides talking about setting proper stocking rates. And then the second PowerPoint that is on Blackboard in a PDF file is the actual um, calculations for stocking rate. So, work through those, and then you guys should be set for next week when we do RDM. All right, so some important things to keep in mind when setting a stocking rate is what type of animal you're actually setting the rate for. So, not only animal species, even though that's a major importance, are you stocking cattle, goats, or sheep, but also the class or the stage of production that they're in. So, on the sheep side, are they mature ewes or are they growing lambs? Same thing for goats and cattle. Again, mature cows or cows nursing calves, and then stockers would be the other big category. The second major consideration is stocking rate. So, a total of how many animals. A lot of times, as producers, we find ourselves in the situation of like we have a certain amount of animals that we need to find feed for. So, if you're in a federal lease, a lot of times you'll have limits on animal units that you need to have on a certain allotment or permit. And so, you have to do a lot of adjusting back and forth to figure out if you're going to have enough cows to go to that allotment, or if you're going to need to bring in more animals, and then or if you have too many and you have to find additional feed for a portion of the herd as well. And then the third major factor is the time of grazing, so when to graze or not to graze. And this can be as simple as seasonality. So, is it a spring, summer allotment? Is it a straight summer, fall allotment like we have here in the North State? Or are you actually grazing, winter foothill area in December through the spring? So that's a pretty broad sense of a grazing system. If we were to add a little bit more detail to that and get more constrictive, you could even take it as far as selecting a specific grazing system. So, are you rotationally grazing? Are you continuously grazing? And if you are doing short duration, high intensity grazing, how often are you moving those animals, and do you have the proper fencing for that to happen? And then finally, the fourth management factor is where the animals graze. So, this relates back to how the animal is actually going to use a piece of rangeland. So, the example that I like to talk about a lot is the hilltoppers and the bottom dweller cows. That if you have a very, very hilly pasture or allotment with some steep, brushy country, a lot of times cows won't go up in elevation very well. So, and they really won't go up in elevation well if there isn't a lot of decent, high quality feed, water, or minerals. So, you have to take that into account when assessing how much you can stock a certain area. So let's make sure we've got a good idea of terminology. So carrying capacity refers to the number of animals that a piece of land can support on a long-term basis without causing damage to the ecosystem. So some things that take into account carrying capacity are the land type and size, as well as the vegetation that it grows. Carrying capacity is usually expressed as animals per area per year. And usually these are going to be in acres or hectares, and sometimes you can see it expressed as AUMs or animal unit months. So when we're talking about land associated with carrying capacity, that is usually going to be how it's actually changes hands. So the real estate portion of that. So if you go online and are just looking up ranches to buy, a lot of times they will have certain AUMs associated with that description of that property. A stocking rate is a little bit different but still related. Stocking rate refers to the number of animals a land manager can place on a piece of land for a specific period of time. And that specific period of time is what everybody forgets in a definition on an exam. Okay, so a stocking rate has to include three major factors. First of all, the number of animals or the animal unit, the specific area, really looking at total number of acres or hectares, and a specific period of time, so days or months. And stocking rates are going to be highly important to grazing decisions because it can affect rangeland health, both short term and long term, as well as economic returns as well on a short term and long term basis as well. So an animal unit is defined as 1,000 pounds of grazing animal. And these are going to be grazing ruminants that we're going to primarily be talking about. Okay, so I gave you a scale of animal units here. So a cow is kind of like the golden child, and I really sincerely hope that BLM and Forest Service and National Park Service don't look at redefining AUMs, because right now one cow, even if she has a calf at her side, is considered one animal unit. Okay, so that is the golden standard. A horse is actually 1.8 of an animal unit, so it's bigger than a cow. And the number of a horse divided by the animal unit is going to be 0.56. So one horse equals about half a cow. And then a yearling steer, we can actually stock a little bit heavier because they're only 3/4 of a mature cow. And a sheep is 20% of a mature cow, and a jackrabbit is 2% of a mature cow. So it would take 50 jackrabbits to equal one animal unit, 5 sheep to equal one animal unit, 1.3 yearling steers to equal an animal unit, and half a horse. So for every wild horse that's grazing on the Modoc Plateau right now, they're actually eating for what we assume is 2 animal units. So that becomes important as we start to look at exactly how much those individual animals are eating. So an animal unit month, or an AUM, is a term that you're going to hear a lot. So it refers to the amount of forage that an animal unit will eat in a month. And if we were to calculate this out pretty easily, a grazing ruminant animal eats about 2.5% of their body weight per day in dry matter. Okay, there's 30 days in a month, so that animal unit month equals 1,000 pounds of grazing animal times 2.5%. So she's going to eat 25 pounds of dry matter per day. Okay, so keep in mind that's dry matter. And then to get that into AUM units, you would take that 25 pounds of dry matter and multiply it times the 30 days in the month. So an animal unit month really equals 750 pounds of dry matter. So some of the basics that you're going to need to know for stocking rate are that proper stocking rate is really based on maintaining a specific amount of plant residue, and we have to maintain that plant residue for the overall health of the plant and for it to regrow. So especially in our dormant species, where if we were grazing during the winter like they do in southern Nevada, northern Arizona, then those BLM permits tend to be winter allotments. So the cows go out during the winter because the weather is pretty mild. But keep in mind that those perennials are going to be dormant during that period. So you don't want to stock an allotment so heavy that they eat down the entire perennial plant and it can't come back in the spring during its juvenile and growth stage. So that becomes very important for regrowth. In our annual systems, we can actually afford to take a little bit more matter off of this year's growth, because our annuals seed out rather than reproduce through rhizomatic or stoloniferous methodology. So we have a pretty good seed bank already in the soil. But one thing that does help that come back a lot faster is that if it has cover to protect the soil and kind of lock in some of that moisture associated with the soil. Other reasons for putting a lot of effort into figuring out stocking rates and then stocking an allotment appropriately is to conserve enough forage for our wildlife species and to prevent erosion. So here's the golden rules of why we want to set our stocking rate below our carrying capacity. And the biggest reason is to allow for drought. So just by stocking conservatively, you're actually building in an insurance plan if you have a pretty severe drought. And it's also going to help allow some flexibility in years that are lowly productive. So, for instance, in the Southwest, we would stock about 6 cows per section if we had a really low rain year. If we had a high rain year, we could stock up to 10 cows per section. So some of the utilization guidelines that we actually encompass as part of stocking rate calculations are shown in this table. So in the left-hand column, that is going to be the percentage of use of some of the major plants, and the right-hand column is going to be the rangeland type. So notice that depending on rangeland type, the percentage that you're going to want to take in the form of forage off of that allotment or that rangeland varies depending on where you're at in the country. So in sagebrush grasslands, like we've got in the Great Basin, you're only going to want to use about 30 to 40% of the plants that are out there. Okay, so shortgrass prairie, because it comes back really, really repetitively, and it is gone through the evolutionary process to have really, really tough species back there, you can take upwards of 50%. In our coniferous forest, you want to only take about 30 to 40% because we have such an overstory of forested areas. And then in our oak woodlands here in California and through the Arkansas and Oklahoma belt, you're going to want to take about 30 to 40%. So that number, I think, goes back and forth. I actually prefer to manage in annual grasslands based on potential rainfall rather than taking a certain percentage of the feed, because as we know, like this past spring, we got a ton of rain. Therefore we get a lot of grass, and so if you aren't stocked high enough to actually take a good 35 to 40% and even 50%, then you end up with huge fire risks.